The Once and Future Present, Episode 21, Everyday Life in 17th and 18th Century Europe. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Once and Future Present. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly overlooked sides of European history, everyday life. We're talking about family, fun, faith, and the rhythms of daily living in the 1600s and 1700s. Basically, we're covering Chapter 18 of McKay, which is all about what life was like for ordinary people during the era of expansion. And when I say expansion, I don't just mean colonies and trade. I mean population growth, economic change, and even cultural habits. With us, as usual, is Professor Theo.
That's right, Casey. It's easy to think of history as a series of wars and revolutions, but what we see in this chapter is that some of the most important changes happen at the level of families, communities, and individuals. This chapter gives us a lens into marriage patterns, childhood, popular leisure, and how beliefs evolved in response to a changing world.
And Dr. Morgan.
And from an economic standpoint, it shows how those big structural forces we've talked about, like commercialization, urbanization, and demographic shifts, actually influence people's daily decisions. When to marry, how to raise children, what kinds of things to buy, and even how to interpret the world through religion or superstition.
I love this kind of history. It makes it feel real. So, let's start with families. I always imagined that people in early modern Europe lived in big households with grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles all under one roof. But the book says that wasn't actually the case.
That's a great place to start. The image of the big extended family living together under one roof is actually more common in parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. But in much of Western and Central Europe, especially in places like England, the Netherlands, and parts of France and Germany, the typical household was a nuclear family. That meant just parents and their children, often 2 to 4 people living together.
And that had a lot to do with economic structure. Most people in Western Europe didn't marry until they could afford to. That usually meant men and women waited until their mid to late 20s before getting married. It was a practical necessity. They needed to save up money, inherit land, or finish an apprenticeship.
So they had to be economically independent first?
Exactly. Economic independence was the foundation for forming a household. You needed to prove that you could support a family. That made marriage more stable, but also delayed. In contrast, in places like Russia or the Balkans, people often married younger and lived in multi-generational households that worked land together.
This delay in marriage in the West actually helped slow down population growth, especially before the Industrial Revolution. It's sometimes called the European marriage pattern, and historians have pointed out how it was different from marriage customs in other regions.
In Chapter 17, there were a lot of changes to agriculture and the economy happening. Did that affect marriage patterns?
Absolutely. The agricultural revolution introduced more efficient ways of farming, which meant fewer laborers were needed in rural areas. That pushed many young people off the land and into cities looking for work. In urban areas, economic uncertainty often delayed marriage even further, reinforcing the trend of later marriage ages.
And with the rise of wage labor and market economies, the idea of marriage as an economic contract became even more pronounced. People waited to marry until they could find stable work or housing, and women, in particular, often became domestic servants for several years before settling down. Domestic service was one of the most common jobs available to young women, but it also made them particularly vulnerable, especially to abuse or assault from male employers. These young women were isolated from their families and lacked legal protections.
That's awful. So they were working hard and still not safe, and no one really protected them?
Unfortunately, no. Women's rights were extremely limited. If a servant was assaulted, it was very difficult for her to seek justice. In many places, women couldn't even testify in court under certain conditions, or their testimonies were heavily discounted, especially if they were unmarried or seen as socially suspect. Legal systems largely reinforced the patriarchal norms of the time.
Wow, that seems really unfair. And it makes me wonder, if marriage was delayed and women were more vulnerable, did that change how relationships worked? The book mentions there was still a lot of premarital sex happening. And then there's this term it uses, an illegitimacy explosion.
Yes. From about 1750 to 1850, especially in cities and market towns, we see a sharp rise in the number of children born outside of wedlock. That's what historians call the illegitimacy explosion. It wasn't necessarily because people were behaving more recklessly, but rather because traditional community structures that used to enforce marriage or punish premarital sex were starting to break down.
Young people were gaining more autonomy. More people were leaving rural villages to work as servants or laborers in towns, away from their families and neighbors. Without that close community supervision, sometimes called community controls, they had more freedom to form romantic relationships. But that mobility also made life more precarious. Jobs were uncertain, housing was temporary, and wages were low. In that kind of unstable environment, relationships didn't always lead to marriage. And if a pregnancy occurred and the couple didn't marry, it led to a rise in illegitimacy.
So, what were these community controls?
They were informal social pressures that helped enforce moral norms. For example, if someone cheated on a spouse or had a child out of wedlock, the village might organize a charivari, which was a noisy, mocking ritual, kind of like a public shaming parade. People would bang pots and pans, sing satirical songs, and sometimes even wear masks. While some charivaris may seem like theatrical or harmless public shaming, others could turn violent, especially toward women who didn't conform to expectations about sexuality or obedience. One particularly brutal punishment was the scold's bridle, a metal cage that fit over the head and clamped the tongue to silence women labeled as nags or gossips. These tools of humiliation and control remind us that community norms were enforced not just socially, but sometimes physically and cruelly.
That sounds like a mix between a protest and a carnival.
In a way, yes. It was about enforcing behavior without involving the authorities. But over time, as people moved into cities and the social bonds of villages weakened, those controls became less effective. The result was more freedom, but also more vulnerability, especially for young women who might be abandoned by their partners or ostracized for having a child outside marriage.
That must have been tough. Did any legal systems step in to help?
Not really, at least not at first. In some regions, poor laws offered limited support to single mothers, but mostly the burden fell on local parishes or charities. There was also a lot of moral judgment attached, and women often bore the blame alone.
It's one of those moments in history where greater individual freedom came with real social costs. And it reminds us that social support systems were still in their infancy, much later than we sometimes think. In response to this crisis, many cities and states began establishing foundling homes, what we might think of as early orphanages. These institutions tried to care for children who were abandoned or whose parents couldn't afford to keep them. But conditions were often terrible. Some foundling hospitals had mortality rates as high as 90%. Others tried to provide basic education or place children in apprenticeships. But it was always a patchwork system, and children born outside of marriage faced enormous disadvantages.
That definitely adds depth. Okay, so now that we've talked about how and when people formed families, I'm wondering about what happened after that. What did raising kids look like?
That's a rich question. For starters, childhood in this era was risky. Infant mortality was still extremely high. Some estimates say as many as 1 in 3 or even 1 in 2 children died before the age of 5. That shaped how families thought about parenting, loss, and emotional attachment.
It also influenced practices like wet nursing. Among wealthier families, and even many in the middle classes, it was common for mothers to send their babies to live with a wet nurse in the countryside. This was often seen as more practical or safer. though in reality it could be quite dangerous due to unsanitary conditions or neglect.
What exactly is a wet nurse?
A wet nurse was a woman who breastfed and cared for another woman's infant. This was especially common among the upper and middle classes. Instead of nursing their babies themselves, many mothers, especially in cities, sent their newborns to live with a wet nurse in the countryside.
It was part of a broader system of child-rearing shaped by class and labor needs. Wet nurses were often poor rural women who took in multiple infants at once. The pay was modest, and the conditions could be terrible. Some did their best, but others were overwhelmed or negligent, especially when they were looking after too many children at once. The mortality rates in some of these arrangements were shockingly high.
So they would literally send their baby away for months?
Sometimes years. And many babies didn't survive the arrangement. Critics at the time, and later historians, saw this as neglectful, but it was deeply ingrained in early modern society. It freed up urban mothers to fulfill social obligations or have more children in rapid succession.
But this started to change in the 18th century. Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau challenged those norms. In his book, Émile, he argued that children needed a natural, nurturing environment to grow up into good citizens. He thought mothers should breastfeed their own children and that education should focus on experience, not rote memorization.
So people really started to think differently about childhood?
Yes, especially among the educated classes. Childhood began to be seen as a unique and important phase of life. Emotional bonding, play, and education started to matter more. You see more toys, children's books, and even specialized furniture for children during this period.
And education expanded too. In Protestant countries, reading the Bible was seen as essential, so elementary schooling spread rapidly. Girls as well as boys were taught to read, though girls often received less instruction in writing or arithmetic.
Was that different in Catholic regions?
Somewhat. Catholic reformers, including the Jesuits, supported schooling as part of moral and religious instruction. But overall, educational expansion in Catholic areas was a bit slower and more focused on religious conformity than literacy for its own sake.
Still, by the late 18th century, literacy rates were climbing across Europe. And literacy wasn't just about reading the Bible anymore. People were consuming chapbooks, almanacs, adventure stories, even political pamphlets. That set the stage for a more informed and critical public. In fact, chapbooks were often used as basic educational tools for children as well. These inexpensive booklets included simple religious texts, fables, or moral lessons designed to help young readers practice their literacy. Alongside chapbooks, we also start to see the emergence of children's literature aimed specifically at teaching reading skills. Books with larger print, illustrations, and stories that encouraged both moral behavior and basic comprehension.
That's pretty heavy. But it also explains why literacy matters so much. If more people were reading and thinking critically, they could start to question those systems, right?
Yes, and one of the most exciting developments of this time was the rise of the novel as a form of entertainment and social commentary. Novels were longer prose stories that explored character, emotion, and often moral dilemmas.
Think of Samuel Richardson's Pamela or Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. These weren't just stories, they were moral journeys. And for women especially, novels became a vital form of both escape and education.
So they weren't just reading for religion or school, they were reading for fun and reflection.
Exactly. And genre fiction started to emerge too. Romances, Gothic tales, even early forms of science fiction. It was a whole new literary marketplace.
And that's where we see the cultural side of the consumer revolution. Books, plays, music, fashion, furniture, all feeding a desire not just to survive, but to enjoy life and cultivate taste.
That connects with something else I wanted to ask. How did people's consumption habits change during this period? Was there really a consumer revolution?
Yes, and it's one of the biggest transformations of the 18th century. The consumer revolution refers to a dramatic rise in the availability and consumption of goods, especially in cities and growing towns. For the first time, people were buying things not just for survival, but for comfort, identity, and status.
Exactly. Items like mirrors, printed cottons, porcelain dishes, and decorative clocks became more affordable for the middle classes. Even many working class people were able to buy modest luxury goods. Clothing was especially important. People began to express themselves through fashion.
Like trends and seasonal styles?
Yes, clothing went from being mostly practical to being expressive. People bought brightly colored fabrics, hats with feathers, or accessories like pocket watches and parasols. It was about looking modern, respectable, and stylish.
And let's not forget where these goods came from. The consumer revolution was powered by global trade. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from China. This growing appetite for exotic imports was deeply tied to imperialism and the labor of enslaved people.
So, people's daily lives were connected to these global systems, even if they didn't always realize it.
Absolutely. That's one of the key insights of this period. The personal became political and economic. Even a cup of sweetened tea in a London kitchen had roots in plantation slavery.
Slavery seems to always be involved somehow. It's interesting that so much of what we think of as modern life, education, entertainment, shopping, was starting to take shape back then.
And speaking of entertainment, let's talk about how people relaxed and had fun in the 18th century. Leisure was still deeply seasonal and often tied to the church calendar, especially in rural areas. But it was also starting to shift with urbanization and growing literacy.
I remember reading about something called blood sports in the book. What were those?
Blood sports were popular forms of public entertainment that involved violence to animals. Think bull baiting, bear baiting, and cockfighting. They were loud, messy, and often took place in open arenas or taverns. People from all social classes might gather to watch.
These events might seem cruel to us today, but they were viewed differently at the time. They reflected a culture where public punishment and spectacle were part of normal life, and they reinforced certain ideas about masculinity, competition, and hierarchy.
Were there any types of leisure that were more communal or festive?
Definitely. Carnival was one of the most important examples. It was held in the weeks before Lent and turned social order upside down. People wore costumes, sang bawdy songs, and mocked the powerful. For a short time, servants acted like masters, and the rules of society were playfully ignored.
Carnival was a mix of celebration and social commentary. It was a time when people could let loose, criticize authority indirectly, and enjoy excess before the restraint of Lent. Authorities often tolerated it, but sometimes cracked down when things got too wild.
So, kind of like Mardi Gras today?
Exactly. It was part of the festive culture of pre-industrial Europe, when the calendar was full of feast days, saints' days, and local festivals. But this was also beginning to change.
Right. As societies became more industrial and disciplined, there was a gradual push to replace that kind of rowdy, communal leisure with more rational forms of entertainment. Think theater, concerts, and eventually museums and parks.
So, leisure became more structured, like school or work.
In some ways, yes. And literacy played a huge role here too. As more people learned to read, private forms of entertainment became more popular. Reading at home, listening to music, or attending a play became alternatives to the noisy tavern or the village square.
The shift wasn't instant, though. Traditional and modern leisure coexisted for a long time. People might read a novel by day and attend a carnival at night. But over time, middle-class norms about respectable entertainment began to dominate.
That's so fascinating. It really shows how even what people did for fun reflects bigger changes in society and values.
And another space where those shifts were especially clear was in religion. While Christianity remained dominant, the way people practiced their faith, how they experienced the sacred, was evolving.
In Protestant regions of Europe, a movement called Pietism gained momentum. Pietism emphasized a personal, emotional connection to God, moral behavior, and Bible reading at home. It was a response to what many felt was a cold or overly intellectual church.
So, was it like a revival movement?
Exactly. Pietism was about bringing religion into the heart of daily life. It encouraged people to reflect deeply, to experience inner transformation, not just go through the motions of attending services.
And in Catholic areas, a parallel current emerged called Jansenism. It emphasized the weight of original sin, human unworthiness, and the need for divine grace. It was especially popular among some urban poor and elite intellectuals, although the Catholic Church eventually condemned it as heresy. Another influential movement was Methodism, which emerged out of the Church of England in the mid-18th century. It was led by John Wesley, who emphasized heartfelt faith, personal salvation, and regular preaching to large audiences, even in open fields. Methodism became incredibly popular among working-class people in both England and parts of continental Europe.
Wait, is that the same John Wesley from the Great Awakening in U.S. history?
Great catch. Yes, it's the same John Wesley. While the Great Awakening is more often associated with figures like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards in colonial America, Wesley's message of personal spiritual rebirth and accessible preaching had a massive impact on both sides of the Atlantic. There were all these debates and emotional tensions. Yes, and it wasn't just in the formal church. Folk religion remained incredibly strong, especially in rural areas. People continued to believe in healing charms, curses, saints' relics, and seasonal rituals. The boundaries between official doctrine and local practice were often blurred.
Some of these practices were tolerated, others condemned. But they show that religion wasn't just a top-down system. It was embedded in the rhythms of everyday life. People sought spiritual comfort wherever they could find it, whether in the parish church, a traveling preacher's sermon, or a whispered blessing from a village healer.
That's such a vivid image. So even as people were moving toward rationalism and science, they were still grounded in emotional, spiritual traditions.
That's the paradox of this period. You had Enlightenment ideas, new scientific thinking, and more secular lifestyles, but also intense religious feeling, personal piety, and magical thinking all existing side by side.
It really gives you a sense of how complex people were, how they tried to make meaning in a rapidly changing world.
And that's the heart of social history. It helps us understand not just what people did, but how they felt, what they believed, and what they hoped for.
Before we wrap up, I noticed there was a little bit in the chapter about medicine. Can we talk about that too?
Of course. Medical knowledge was still a mix of traditional practices and early scientific approaches. Many people still believed in the humoral theory, the idea that health came from balancing bodily fluids like blood, phlegm, and bile. This theory had dominated Western medicine since ancient times.
Most care was provided by apothecaries, midwives, and barber surgeons. Apothecaries sold herbal remedies and chemical compounds, often operating out of small shops. Midwives played a crucial role in childbirth, especially for women in rural or lower-class communities, though their authority was increasingly challenged by male physicians.
And state involvement in medicine was growing. Governments began to license practitioners and regulate urban sanitation, especially in cities where disease spread quickly. But formal hospitals were still places of last resort, often associated with poverty, overcrowding, and poor hygiene.
So it sounds like people had more options than before, but it wasn't exactly modern medicine yet.
Right? It was a transitional time. You had new ideas coming from anatomy and chemistry, but most people still relied on traditional healers and familiar remedies. That blend of old and new is part of what makes the 18th century so fascinating.
I didn't expect a chapter on daily life to touch on everything from blood sports and carnival to novels, parenting styles, and global trade, but it all fits together. You really see how people's values and routines shaped and were shaped by these bigger historical changes.
That's the beauty of history from the ground up. It helps us understand not only events, but lived experience, the things people carried, believed, feared, and celebrated.
And it reminds us that history isn't just about what happened to kings and generals. It's also about a mother sending her child to a wet nurse, or a young woman reading her first novel by candlelight, or a village gathering for a noisy carnival before Lent.
Well, that's going to stay with me. And for everyone listening, we're just getting started. Next episode, we're diving into the Age of Revolutions. We'll make a brief stop in the newly independent United States, explore the radical transformation in Haiti, and then take a deep dive into France, where revolution reshaped politics, society, and the very meaning of citizenship. Don't forget to check out our AP Euro and AP US albums on Spotify, YouTube Music, iTunes, and all the major platforms. And as always, stay curious, think critically,